Thank you, Senator Smith. We'll now go to Senator Waters.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, Dr Novak. Appreciate your attendance today. Just on your last point, you said you accepted that there was, in your words, residual gender discrimination, but that it was being progressively wiped out. How long do you think women have to wait for it to be wiped out?
Oh, look, that is a very, very fair question. I sort of grant you that. I think that one of the most effective salves against any residual discrimination in the workforce is not through legislative means. In fact, Senator, I actually think that one of the most effective sort of salves or remedies against residual discrimination is basically through sort of non-governmental sort of social processes, basically highlighting any impacts of residual discrimination. The fact that we're actually having these sorts of discussions today in Parliament and elsewhere in society, I think has proven to be very helpful, and just putting out the hard evidence that, you know, women are now embodied with much more human capital, skills and capabilities than really ever before in a formal sense. And really, when you think about it, I mean, you know, most people have a gender identity as it is, and so it really costs people in the long run to basically overly discriminate on the basis of those background characteristics rather than their inherent talents and capabilities. So, look, I mean, I do certainly agree that there is some residual discrimination, but it can be wiped out, and the best way to wipe it out is through those sort of social processes, right, which emphasise the value that women can actually play in the economic processes. It's happening each and every day, and I'm very, very sure that those kinds of processes are having a beneficial effect in the long run.
I don't quite understand what you mean, to be perfectly honest, when you're saying that because we're having a discussion here in Parliament about these issues and yet we don't need a legislative response. What social processes precisely are you referring to?
Well, I'm talking about the social practices of the general observed economic improvement that has been accorded to women in the main without recourse to any sort of legislative mandates to ensure sort of favouritism on the basis of gender identity. I mean, you and I should know sort of full well that women as a whole have improved dramatically in our sort of economic and social status over time. And we haven't required gender-based targets or quotas or anything like that in order to sort of get through. It's basically you want sort of open economic processes, and you want, you know, basically a free-flowing discussion in society as well to basically convince people of the imperative of opening up your consideration for all the talents, really, and that includes the talents that are embodied in women.
Thank you. I don't accept that we've made enough progress to date, and I think that the pace of change towards gender equality has been painfully slow, and I don't accept that we should remain on that trajectory of change. I'm
we have a disagreement, that's fine.
Sure, thank you. I'm interested to tease out, you've made some statements about you think the progress is occurring already and we don't effectively need any legislative intervention to hurry it along. If your argument's held, why don't we have equality already?
Well, equality in terms of what, though? Because we have to bear in mind that the numerical notions of equality intersect with the very facts of choice, right? Because, I mean, it's not the case that all women necessarily would want to vie for senior roles in sort of major corporations or major government bodies. We can't assume that people are homogenous in terms of preferences and tastes. I know, for one, I'm not interested in those roles. So, you know, so a sort of a marked sort of basis, an emphasis on numerical sort of ambitions or targets or objectives won't include people like me anyway, because I'm not interested in senior roles like that.
Right, so you think if women were choosing to be in those senior roles, they could effectively click their fingers and be in them. Is that what you're contending? That there are in fact no barriers to women other than their own choosing?
Well, I thought my evidence about 2 or 3 minutes ago stated that there were residual, in my belief, some instances of residualised discrimination against women. I mean, it's been a historical fact, obviously, that there had been discrimination against women, and that has been legally entrenched, for example, through, the marriage bar, which operated in the APS until, the mid to late 1960s. So it's quite clear that there has been historical discrimination against women on the basis of sort of many variables and factors. It's not to say that it hasn't been on the improve.
Well, just to follow up on that point, you mentioned earlier that you accepted that there was a hiring bias. I hope I've not, I think I've jotted down the right phrase that you used. And we've had a lot of discussion about unconscious bias in this space, and that folk doing the hiring subconsciously select people who are like them. And so inevitably, when you have a predominance of men making these appointments, they unconsciously are more likely to select other men. So I think you've said you accept that there is that hiring bias, and you've also said you accept that there is residual discrimination. What then do you propose to do to fix that?
Well, I essentially argue for an openness of the economic process, and by and large, certainly the economic process is not open. We have extensive regulations and governmental interference in the economy as a whole, which actually prevent women, for example, from accumulating even more sort of human capital, skills and capabilities, essentially, particularly at the sort of lower rungs of the income distribution when you sort of think about issues like occupational licensing and the like. So, I mean, these sort of factors are pretty important to bear. I actually maintain this sort of the notion that I've expressed before, that if you have a more competitive, open sort of economic process, and a more so dynamic social process too, I should add, then basically the costs of discrimination become more apparent over time. It just doesn't make any sense for firms and organisations to be in the long term sort of discriminating against women who can sort of provide sufficient economic value to production processes. So, and we want more economic freedom to make sure that the costs of those sorts of discriminations are exposed to the discriminators in particular.
Okay, just two more quick questions, if I may, Chair. You're talking about the costs of not giving women the fair go that they deserve, but I thought, and pardon me, I was a minute or so late into your evidence, I thought you were saying that you rejected the findings that, in fact, women with boards with more women on them led to better performance. So I'm just a little bit of an inconsistency there. If you could clarify that for me, please.
No, I don't think there's any inconsistency really. I mean, it is quite clear that the empirical evidence is mixed, and in fact, I would argue that the admixture of findings in the empirical evidence would probably dictate against any action bias on the part of the Parliament or government of the day in particular to sort of act sort of in favour of this issue one way or the other until there is actually more compelling evidence. You want really a consensus of evidence which actually suggests that greater gender-based diversity in boards actually does improve board performance, and it seems to me there's sufficient weight of evidence to say that's actually not clear at all. So the point of the evidence that I brought to bear this morning was to indicate that there is no consensus in the empirical literature about the broader effects of gender quotas, and in fact there are a number of studies which actually say that the application of gender quotas or targets and the like may be detrimental to the interests of firms, and perhaps very unseemly to the interests of women themselves, which is obviously we don't want.
So can I just ask, what's your reaction then to the Centre for Gender Economics and Innovation Gender Index, which was launched in April this year, which found that of the ASX 200 companies where boards had at least 1/4 women, that they exceeded the performance of companies generally by 2%, and they outperformed all male boards by more than 7% per annum. What say you to that evidence?
I have not seen that particular study, but I'll certainly be very, very interested to sort of look at that study at another time. But I'd be first and foremost interested to actually look at the methodology of those kinds of studies. I'd be very interested to see what kinds of control factors are put in place when thinking about the empirical implications of the effect of gender composition on firm performance or on board performance in particular. It doesn't really tell you a fulsome story when you're actually just looking at a sort of simple relationship between the two variables. There are many complex factors which inform firm performance. And interestingly enough, if you look at some of the sort of the studies about the Norwegian sort of gender quota experience, there is a debate about how you actually control, for example, for the effect of business cycles, which are obviously one important other additional sort of factor when thinking about firm performance. So I'd probably be wanting to look very closely at the methodology of that study before making any sort of definitive sort of statement as to whether I'm in agreement with it or not, to be frank with you.
Okay, and just one final question, if I may, Chair.
Senator Waters.
Thank you. How do you propose that we redress gender inequality without affirmative action?
Well, as I've said before, the process of gender discrimination is given succor in an environment where there is less economic openness and less economic freedom. If you sort of take the ideas of Gary Becker and other economists, right, to hand, you would understand that there is a cost of discrimination to discriminators to the extent that they choose not to employ a person who could provide compelling value to a firm. Now, that is certainly in the immediate sense a problem for the person who's discriminated against, but it is, by the same token, a problem for the discriminator. And so you really want an open situation in which the cost of discrimination is exposed more fully in a more competitive marketplace. And one thing I might add to my statements as well is that we do tend to ignore the important roles of sort of women in self-made businesses as part of the broader sort of gender equality in the economy story. We know there are over 400,000 women running their own businesses. They are their own self-made bosses, and this is an issue that is not duly considered in these sorts of debates, which seem to me to be inordinately focused on numerical averages, say within the public sector or the private sector or in certain classes of firms. So I think the key ingredient, the key answer to wiping away gender-based discrimination is through more economic freedom, more labour market openness, and essentially a continuation of a discussion highlighting the extent to which any residual discrimination is occurring in the workforce and addressing the means to sort of respond to those. I mean, after all, in the private sector, firms still have opportunities to rectify the costs of discrimination which harm them through employing more women. And that, to be sure, has been a long-run trend. Look at the improvements in female labour market participation. Look at the trends, the long-run trends in female employment. Look at the trends in female representation in senior boards and management echelons within companies. Look at the number of women in business, number of women participating in education. There has been a long-run improvement. That's incontrovertible.
It's too slow. Okay. Thank you.
With that